Health Services Program Director Darlene Lamascus admitted that the Corrections Department supplied incorrect figures concerning the number of inmates swallowing psychotropic drugs. Last week, court fact finder John Albach testified that 23% of state prisoners were taking powerful tranquilizers. Lamascus said the actual number is about 7%. ACLU attorney Lou Bullock accused the state of playing with the numbers in order to make the fact finder look bad. Another witness testified about the reason why Oklahoma's prisons have suddenly become crowded. OU geography professor Dr. Gary Thompson blamed the swelling prison population on the baby boom, putting more young people into the crime-prone years. Dr. Thompson predicts a future prison population drop, similar to the recent drop in student enrollment.
There's a lag in the prison situation because those arrested last year, many of them have not yet been sentenced. So there is a lag of a year or two. It's not a direct proportion as in the case of those coming to the university.
Do they raise taxes? That's always possible. But the governor's position is let's wait till January, make that determination then. But in November, when he meets with the Equalization Board, that's when the actual figure will be set. And the figures we're working with today show that when you put together the formula, the last 5 years you're going to be short.
On return on equity, on construction work in progress, and on cash working capital, the three items that we looked at, we come out saying that this company is doing just fine, and it really is not entitled to a rate increase at this time. We feel that it's a well-run company and that it's doing very nicely and that they really don't need additional revenues from ratepayers.
ACLU attorney Lou Bullock closely questioned Conner prison warden Tim West about prison guards' use of weapons during the riot. West admitted that guards atop the prison's control center began shooting over inmates' heads in an effort to keep the rioters away from a security area. One of those shots killed an inmate during that riot. In other action, Judge Bohannon repeated his desire to appoint a 15-member citizens panel to inspect Oklahoma's prisons. The attorney representing Oklahoma's inmates endorsed the judge's suggestion, especially in light of recent comments by Governor Nye that there is no solution to prison problems in Oklahoma.
We've got a governor who's painted himself into a corner and now is saying that there's no way to prevent these types of disturbances. Oklahoma doesn't have the money to continue to throw down the rat hole of corrections. We've got to run our prisons in a manner where they will not explode and where our investment is protected. And for the governor to take that type of a position is to condemn us to an ever-ending cycle of rebuilding prison after prison. And that's not fair to the taxpayers, it's not fair to the inmates, it's not fair to the people that we put in there to staff them.
If, in fact, contracting with ARA is saving the tax. So what I have prepared here is a resolution.
When a prison is authorized for construction by the legislature, funds available, it takes 3 years to build such a prison. So if we started in today, to build additional beds for what we perceive as the gain. We will be 3 years behind.
We have been in a period of recession, economic recession, coupling that with the overcapacity of refining. It was determined that from a long-term standpoint that Champlin did not want to operate continue to operate the Enid refinery.
The Kerr-McGee plutonium processing plant near Crescent, Oklahoma isn't operating anymore. But in 1974, it was at this plant that Karen Silkwood was an employee and union activist. And it was while she was an employee here that she was contaminated with highly radioactive plutonium. Silkwood allegedly had documents showing the plant was shipping out defective plutonium fuel rods. She was on her way to a meeting with a reporter in Oklahoma City the night of November 13, 1974. When her car ran off Highway 74 and crashed into a ditch. Silkwood was killed and the documents were never found. Today, weeds cover up the area where she died that night, and her death was ruled accidental. 1 week prior to her death, her Edmond apartment was found to be heavily contaminated with plutonium, allegedly from the plant. Silkwood relatives sued Kerr-McGee, and nearly 5 years after her death, the case went to trial in an Oklahoma City federal courtroom. After a much-publicized 11-week trial, one of the longest in Oklahoma history, in May of 1979, the jury awarded the Silkwood estate $10.5 million in damages for Karen Silkwood's plutonium contamination. But in 1981, an appeals court threw out all but $5,000 of that. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled any damages should have been handled by Workmen's Compensation Court, and that federal regulation of the nuclear industry prohibited the awarding of the $10 million in punitive damages to the Silkwood family. Kerr-McGee attorney Bill Paul agrees with that assessment and says he believes the Supreme Court will agree. The nuclear industry, including the Kerr-McGee plant, is special and not subject to state punitive damage laws.
If you're going to have a nuclear industry, I really don't think that the industry can operate unless they've got one uniform set of rules and overseers to go by.
But at the Supreme Court tomorrow, Silkwood attorneys will argue that Congress did not intend to preempt the nuclear industry from punitive damages, and that Kerr-McGee should be subject to the same laws as other companies. The attorneys general of 16 other states will be backing the Silkwood appeal. Oklahoma is not one of them.
The technical issue before the court is whether the 10th Circuit was correct in holding that punitive damages under Oklahoma law could not be awarded against a nuclear facility, no matter how reckless the conduct that would give rise to a punitive award.
Next month, it will be 9 years since Karen Silkwood died, and even now there's strong disagreement over whether she was a heroine or a villain. But the Supreme Court won't be considering any of that. Their only decision to make is whether or not they'll hear the case. And after almost 9 years, it will be a few months more before we know their decision. Jeff Fowler, Action 4 near Crescent, Oklahoma.
A lot of times people nowadays tend to buy their gasoline in self-service stations, and they don't have somebody to look under the hood for them, so they can neglect that. So it's a tendency the car tends to be neglected and go for a long time without having the basic maintenance checks done to it.
They have a bird convention every day above my automobile, and this is a result of it. They must have an argument because you can see what they drop on it.
Oklahoma City Judge Albert Alexander knows exactly what it's like to be dumped on, or to be more precise, on his car. He is just one of several city judges to declare war on birds, who turn cars into instant restrooms. Bird droppings have forced the city's judicial leaders to take action. Judge Alexander took me to the battleground. These trees hang right over his assigned parking space. He thinks the trees are every bird's favorite. Well, the trees can stay, but the limbs above the cars will have to go. Judges have dipped into their own pockets to buy their main weapons, rubber snakes, hopefully realistic enough to frighten birds away from this bombing area. Tying snakes to the trees was the last resort.
If they'd use one spot, I'd get me a pot, but they don't use one spot, so that means that I have to get a cover for the whole automobile, but then I'd have a problem washing my cover every day. So it's easy for me to wash my car every day than to wash my cover every day. I'm more than a bird watcher. See, I want to be a bird eliminator or eradicator.
Judge Alexander says the rubber snakes are a proven method for conveying a message to birds. That is, if the little chirpers have to go, then don't do it on cars protected by toy reptiles. Ed Stewart, Action 4.
Why don't you come on down here? We've got someone that wants to tell you something special. Go ahead.
Hey, Brian. We have quite a surprise for you two young people. You two boys are going somewhere. And I'll see if you can, you tell me where you're going. You two fellas will be going with one of your members of your family to Hawaii for the OU Hawaii game in December, which is played December the 3rd. We want to thank you and everybody be happy. I think the news media might want to ask you some questions, so if you fellas can answer them. I know this is a total surprise to both of you because you had no idea.
It was a quiet morning in Sapulpa today, as law officials from all over the Southwest showed up to pay final respects to slain Oklahoma Highway Patrolman Leon Bench. Bench, gunned down Wednesday on a highway outside of Sapulpa, was honored by his comrades.
Reset! Ho!
The services took place in the same church Bench and his wife Mary Ann were married in 2 years ago. The officer is survived by his wife and an infant daughter born this summer. Kevin Ogle, Action 4 in Sapulpa.
Trauma surgeons like me and Dr. Bethencourt are especially liable to get hepatitis B. That's because the hepatitis B virus is carried primarily in blood and blood products. In fact, all people involved in emergency medicine have to watch out for exposure to hepatitis B. There are all kinds of ways that we get exposed, such as with sticking needles in ourselves, being cut with scalpels, or even with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in injured people that have done a lot of bleeding. Drug abusers are also likely hepatitis victims because they are contaminated with needles that have been used by people with hepatitis. But probably one of the largest groups of people affected by hepatitis B is the homosexual population.
Because of their sexual practices in which a lot of serum and blood products contaminate various mucosal surfaces.
No matter how you get hepatitis B, Dr. Ribner stresses that you should refrain from all sexual activity during the early stages of the disease when it's highly contagious. And it's also a good idea to avoid any dental work or elective operations when medical personnel could risk being infected by your blood. Now, a lot of progress has been made in recent years with this particular problem. Nowadays, when folks like me get stuck or cut when they're dealing with a patient with hepatitis B, there's a vaccine available that will pretty well prevent the infection. And let me tell you, it's worth preventing. 10% of people with hepatitis B go ahead and develop chronic active hepatitis and probably cirrhosis. But 90% of them get well, and they're probably immune for life. Take good care of yourself. I'm Dr. Red Duke. Now, if you've been watching us this week, you know we've been talking about hepatitis A and hepatitis B. Now, there's another kind of hepatitis that folks have that we don't know a lot about. It's called non-A, non-B.
We do the blood tests and we find out they don't have hepatitis A, and we find out they don't have hepatitis B, and so we stick them into this large pool and say they have non-A, non-B.
Now, we doctors are really not sure what causes non-A, non-B hepatitis. But surprisingly, about 25% of all patients known to have hepatitis are designated as non-A, non-B.
Individuals who have non-A, non-B hepatitis, our usual recommendations are similar to that of hepatitis B. No elective procedures, careful handling of their blood or any instruments that come into contact with their blood, and refraining from sexual activity during the acute episode.
For the most part, we treat non-A, non-B hepatitis like any other kind. We recommend lots of bed rest, a good balanced diet, and really stay away from alcohol. Remember, hepatitis is an inflammation of the liver. Alcohol always injures the liver. Now, please bear in mind, hepatitis is not an issue to be ignored. A small but significant group of non-A, non-B, and hepatitis B patients never fully recover. They go on to develop serious chronic liver disease, one manifestation of which is what we call cirrhosis. It sure doesn't make any sense to continue to injure the liver. So stay away from alcohol. It's just not worth it in the long run. Take good care of yourself. I'm Dr. Red Duke.
A little touch of East German artwork was on display in Oklahoma City this afternoon. Volkmar Breschneider, a master of Meissen porcelain artwork, was demonstrating his special talents at B.C. Clark Jewelry Store. Breschneider is on a tour of the United States promoting the Meissen product, and he attracted plenty of interested people today. The trademark of the Meissen collection is the painstaking detail going into each piece of porcelain. Breschneider is one of the best in the world.
This fellow is one of the top 5 artists of the manufactory, and after 39 years being a painter, he is now a designer of the manufactory Meissen, and he developed new patterns in modern style for the manufactory Meissen.
The Meissen Company is responsible for dozens of priceless figurines and tureens manufactured for European royalty, dating all the way back to the 1700s. And thanks to dedicated artists like Volkmar Breschneider, the tradition lives on today. Kevin Ogle, Action 4.
Oh, it's been absolutely terrible. I suspect my mother has had almost a nervous breakdown over this. It's been rough at Christmas time when you know you've got one member that's not there. And it's absolutely terrible what you go through with a missing child. It's not mine, but it's one of my nieces, and therefore I miss her just about as much as anybody.
The problem at Central State University in Edmond is one of increasing enrollment. While that may mean more in tuition money, tuition only pays a fraction of the cost of education. CSU cut back $1 million out of its budget this year and would like to have a substantial increase for next year because more and more students are coming to Central State. The Math and Computer Science building is already overcrowded, and since there's a hiring freeze, no new teachers will be hired to accommodate the extra students. So, where will Central State make those cutbacks?
Reducing the teaching faculty and administration by 69, support personnel by about 100, consider eliminating summer school, the late evening classes, postpone purchase of needed supplies and equipment, which we've already postponed 1 year.
The situation is no better at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater. The school would like a 25% increase in its budget, otherwise some cutbacks will be needed on equipment, supplies, and purchases. Neither school is talking about laying off teachers yet, but both schools are in a very delicate situation, and it's hard to stay flexible when the money is so tight. Now, some good news in terms of financial aid for students. Scott Wallace has that story.
Have you ever noticed that just about every school year you hear about an outbreak of chicken pox? Now, if your child hadn't had chicken pox, the chances are he will eventually get it.
Chicken pox is probably one of the most contagious diseases, and if you're around someone with chicken pox and you have not had it, you probably will get it.
Dr. Pickering says there are basically 3 warning signs of chicken pox.
One is the child says he doesn't feel well. Secondly, he may have a low-grade fever, or thirdly, he may note that he has a rash on his skin that generally will form into a vesicle.
The vesicle about which Dr. Pickering is speaking is just a tiny blister, and it itches like crazy.
If you become overheated or take a bath where the water is too hot, then the rash will tend to be more itchy than it normally is. So you try to keep people cool during these periods.
Now, one of these days, there's going to be a vaccine for chicken pox, just like we have for measles and mumps. But until then, chicken pox is just a fact of life for most kids and a few adults. Now, you know, the best fact about chicken pox is the fact that it's usually not a very bad disease. It only lasts about a week or so. And if you've had it once, you're immune for life. Take care of yourself. I'm Dr. Red Duke. You know, when most of us adults were kids, having the 3-day measles, or rubella, if you will, was just a matter of course. But now today, after a lot of great research, vaccines are available for measles, mumps, and the 3-day measles, and they're gradually disappearing.
The problem with rubella lies in the fact that if a woman who is pregnant develops rubella, then it can be devastating for her unborn child.
A woman who contracts rubella during the first 3 months of pregnancy runs a 50% chance of having a child with a congenital birth defect.
If you don't know that you've had rubella, your doctor can determine it by a simple blood test. This is particularly important in women going into or in childbearing years.
Well, you think you've had rubella or German measles, but maybe you're not too sure. Won't you go ahead and have the test made anyway? Just be sure. Now, if your doctor determines that you've not had rubella, he can immunize you against it before you get pregnant. And this simply enhances your chances of having a normal child. It's really worth the trouble. I'm Dr. Red Duke. You know, in all likelihood, in my lifetime and years, it will not even be necessary to give a health report on measles or mumps. If you're doing what your doctor says, you're immunizing your child against measles, mumps, and rubella at the age of 15 months. But you know, red measles is not just a disease that you see in younger children. Every now and then you hear of an outbreak that occurs on college campuses.
The symptoms of hard measles are a high fever. You can have temperatures up to 103 to 104. A fairly significant rash all over your body, a lot of conjunctivitis where your eyes will water and get very red.
Now there's another form of measles, German measles, that's not quite so hard on you. It may only last a few days. Its biggest risk is to the pregnant woman. Both forms of measles are very contagious. And if you haven't been immunized against them, you're probably going to get it if you're exposed to the disease. Mumps is not so contagious, and therefore you don't see it as often.
And it generally involves the salivary glands of the face, and most people are familiar with the swelling that you get right in this area due to these salivary glands enlarging due to the virus.
Now, sometimes the mumps virus infects the reproductive gland, like the testicles in a boy or the ovaries in a young girl. They usually manifest themselves by some swelling. If this happens, please contact your physician. Now, measles and mumps usually last between 7 to 10 days in children, and it's usually not a very complicated disease. But if as an adult you contract the disease, you really ought to check with your physician. Don't ignore problems. I'm Dr. Red Duke.
As the weekend approaches, the town of Lindsay is hanging on but not breathing easy. The skies give an ominous threat that nature may unleash another downpour into the swollen Washita River. And if that isn't bad enough, word has come that floodgates may be open at Fort Cobb. The people are preparing as best they can. Area businesses are supplying sand and manpower to help keep the river from encroaching any further into the town or into people's homes. Ordinarily, John Morgan's home isn't this close to the river. That has Morgan concerned. He and his son, Royce, are hoping that even if the water reaches the house, they can at least keep it from getting into the cellar.
They say stuff from Chickasha's coming down, so it might be pretty bad. I don't know. It might get worse or it might not get no worse. I hope it don't.
Larry Parks doesn't have the option of keeping the water out of his house anymore. It is already 5 inches deep inside. He and friends are trying to save what appliances they can before the water gets any higher. Civil defense officials say the river may not crest for another 2 or 3 days. If the waters do continue to rise, there will be more people who find themselves stranded in their Lindsay homes. So far, the people who have had to be evacuated have been able to move in with family members or into private houses. But as more people are driven from their homes, the town of Lindsay is preparing to take care of them. Charles Schnitzer, Action 4, in Lindsay, Oklahoma.
Western companies donated lots of help to us, and we appreciate them. Local city employees have donated lots of help to us. NL, Acme Tools sent some help to us. Phillips and City Service have done some stuff for us. So we're getting along with lots of help right now. The local Air Force unit I shouldn't say local, the Air Force unit out of Enid has sent some help to us. And so right now we're doing pretty good. But you know, if it lasts for 3 days, well, we don't know what it'll amount to.